In the heart of Harlem, where history breathes through brownstone walls and protest songs echo down centuries, a new kind of rebellion began to take shape, not with gunfire or slogans painted on banners, but through ballots, belief, and a reclamation of power. This was not the rebellion of the 1960s, the marches, the sit-ins, or the militant manifestos, but something subtler, strategic, and deeply rooted in the evolving conscience of a generation left disillusioned by both capitalism and complacency. The world had changed since the Civil Rights Revolution. The battleground was no longer segregation, but survival in a system that had promised equality, yet delivered exhaustion. Housing costs soared, wages stagnated, and immigrant families from Ghana to Bangladesh worked endless shifts just to stay afloat. Harlem, once a symbol of black cultural renaissance, had become ground zero for the struggles of globalization, gentrification, and generational frustration. And amid this restless terrain rose a name that would come to represent a new political awakening: Zohran Kwame Mamdani. Born in Kampala, Uganda in 1991 to the celebrated academic Mahmoud Mamdani and filmmaker Mira Nair, Zohran's early life was shaped by two distinct but converging worlds, one of critical theory and the other of cinematic storytelling. His father dissected systems of power, his mother captured their human cost. Together, their influence formed a foundation that valued both intellect and empathy, an education that transcended classrooms. When Zohran's family moved to New York, the city of contradictions became his second classroom. The glitter of Wall Street stood beside the shadows of systemic inequality. The rhetoric of opportunity clashed with the reality of eviction notices and minimum wage jobs. For many, this was simply the way the world worked, but for Zohran, these contradictions became questions, and eventually, causes. In the early 2000s, America was still nursing the illusions of unchallenged capitalism and global dominance. The financial crisis of 2008 would shatter much of that illusion, exposing the fragility of a system built on speculation, debt, and inequality. Millions lost homes and livelihoods. Harlem, like countless working-class neighborhoods, bore the weight of that collapse. And as Washington bailed out banks while citizens queued for unemployment benefits, a quiet fury began to simmer across a generation that had been told to dream big, only to inherit debt and despair. It was in this crucible that the New Left, a term once synonymous with the 1960s anti-war movements, found its rebirth. But this time, the struggle was digital, decentralized, and driven by an ethos of intersectional justice. Issues of race, class, gender, and climate were no longer separate fronts. They were interconnected threads of a single tapestry of resistance. Mamdani's journey into politics would take place against this backdrop, a confluence of local struggles and global awareness, where activism was no longer confined to protest signs, but expressed through grassroots organizing, mutual aid, and community defense. In 2019, the political map of New York began to shift. The rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a former bartender turned congresswoman, signaled that the impossible was possible again. The Democratic establishment, long insulated by corporate donors and party machinery, was facing an insurgency from within. The Democratic Socialists of America had become the ideological engine of this transformation, harnessing the discontent of a generation radicalized by crisis after crisis: the Great Recession, student debt, climate collapse, and racial injustice. For Zohran Mamdani, the movement was not theoretical, it was personal. Queens and Harlem, the neighborhoods he sought to represent, were mosaics of working-class immigrants: South Asians, Latinos, Black Americans, and Arabs. They shared not only geography, but struggle: the rising rents, the exploitative landlords, the decaying transit, and the indifference of state politics. And so Mamdani launched a campaign that rejected the traditional script of political ambition. There were no lobbyists, no corporate donations, no glossy slogans. Instead, there were volunteers knocking on doors in the freezing winter, tenants organizing against eviction, and young activists translating flyers into Urdu, Bengali, and Spanish. This was politics stripped of pretense, raw, real, and rooted in community. When Zohran ran for New York State Assembly in District 36, few gave him a chance. He was challenging Arabella Simotis, a seasoned incumbent with deep ties to the Democratic Party establishment. But the tide had turned. The electorate was younger, angrier, and increasingly aware that incremental change could not address structural decay. Mamdani's message was simple but radical. Housing is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. The working class deserves power, not pity. It was a campaign defined not by celebrity endorsements, but by credibility, built one doorstep, one conversation, one promise at a time. And when the ballots were counted in 2020, the impossible happened again. Zohran Mamdani, the son of immigrants, the community organizer, the socialist, had defeated the establishment. The rebellion had entered the halls of power. But to understand Mamdani's victory is to understand something deeper, a generational shift in political consciousness. The new left of the 21st century did not emerge from ivory towers or think tanks. It emerged from crisis, the financial collapse, the climate emergency, the failures of neoliberalism. For decades, politics had been reduced to management, a sterile balancing act between markets and moderation. Mamdani and his peers refused this premise. They argued that capitalism itself, not just corruption or inefficiency, was at the root of inequality. This was not just reform, it was reframing. Where mainstream politicians saw issues, Mamdani saw interconnected systems of oppression, landlords exploiting tenants, corporations polluting neighborhoods, developers erasing communities. And while establishment figures called for realistic solutions, Mamdani insisted that realism without justice was resignation. His rhetoric was unapologetically moral. The fight for universal health care was not a policy debate. It was a moral necessity. The battle against police brutality was not a partisan issue. It was a human imperative. This clarity, moral, ideological, and emotional, became the hallmark of the new progressive rebellion. Inside the assembly, Mamdani carried his activism into the legislative arena. He championed good cause eviction, public banking, and taxing the ultra-rich, policies designed to redistribute not only wealth, but power. Each initiative faced resistance from entrenched interests, landlords, lobbyists, and corporate Democrats. But that resistance only fueled his message, that politics at its core is not about compromise between unequals, but about conflict between the powerful and the powerless. He once said, "If you are not willing to be hated by the powerful, you are not ready to serve the people." And in that conviction, he echoed generations of radicals before him, from Eugene Debs to Angela Davis, from Malcolm X to Bernie Sanders. Mamdani's presence in the assembly symbolized something larger than a single seat. It was proof that ideas once dismissed as fringe had entered the mainstream. Socialism, long treated as a relic of Cold War paranoia, was now part of everyday political discourse. But with progress came polarization. The right-wing media branded him a radical, while even centrist Democrats accused him of divisiveness. Yet to his supporters, this criticism confirmed that he was doing something right, shaking a system that had grown too comfortable with inequality. Mamdani did not seek validation from the powerful. His audience was the people, the renters, the underpaid, the uninsured. Through social media, he spoke directly to them, bypassing traditional press filters. His tone, earnest, unpolished, direct, mirrored the authenticity that defined the New Left's appeal. And in doing so, he joined a chorus of young leaders across the world, from Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush in the U.S., to Jeremy Corbyn's Labor left, and climate activists like Greta Thunberg, all articulating a global movement bound by shared values: dignity, justice, sustainability, and solidarity. But as with all revolutions, the challenge was not only to win, but to govern. Inside institutions built to preserve the status quo, radicals often face the paradox of power: how to resist co-optation while remaining effective. For Mamdani, this meant redefining representation itself. He viewed his office not as a position of authority, but as a platform for amplification. The voices that had long been ignored, tenants, migrants, workers, became central to policymaking. Every policy was framed not as charity, but as justice delayed. Every speech was a reminder that politics was not about consensus, but about courage. His journey symbolized a rebirth of public faith, not in politicians, but in the possibility of collective action. By the mid-2020s, Zohran Mamdani had become both symbol and strategist for the progressive rebellion, the embodiment of what the New Left aspired to be: intellectual yet accessible, radical yet pragmatic, uncompromising yet empathetic. He represented a politics of care, not in sentiment, but in structure. A belief that the role of government is not to manage despair, but to eliminate its causes. Through his speeches, organizing, and coalition building, Mamdani helped articulate the moral spine of the New Left, that democracy must be more than procedure, it must be participation, that justice must be more than rhetoric, it must be redistribution. The rebellion he helped inspire was not confined to New York. Across the world, young leaders echoed his vision: community-driven, economically just, and environmentally conscious. From Chile's student-led revolts to South Africa's housing movements, from India's farmers' protests to Britain's renters' unions, the New Left had found its rhythm, its lexicon, and its champions. It was not a single ideology, but a shared awakening, a realization that politics had to serve life, not the market. And so, as the cameras pan across the streets of Harlem, past murals of Malcolm X, posters of rent strikes, and faces of a new generation organizing online and offline, one truth becomes clear. Rebellion, in the 21st century, no longer wears the uniform of insurrection. It wears the quiet resolve of community meetings, the solidarity of mutual aid, the determination of those who still believe that justice is worth the fight. Zohran Mamdani stands not as a solitary figure, but as part of a lineage, one that stretches from the anti-colonial thinkers of the Global South to the grassroots radicals of America's streets. In his voice, the New Left finds its echo, grounded in history, alive in struggle, and reaching, always, toward the future. By the second decade of the 21st century, a new political current was stirring across the United States, a current that did not flow from the boardrooms of Washington or the campaign machines of the powerful, but from the classrooms, the picket lines, and the restless hearts of the young. This was the New Left, reborn not as an echo of the 1960s, but as its reimagination for a digital, diverse, and disillusioned generation. Its architects were not the radicals of Berkeley or the revolutionaries of Cuba. They were teachers, tenants, tech workers, and immigrants, people who had grown up watching the promises of globalization crumble into debt, burnout, and despair. And among them stood Zohran Mamdani, a voice shaped by heritage, sharpened by struggle, and sustained by hope. To understand the anatomy of this New Left is to trace the journey of millions who felt abandoned by both the conservative old guard and the centrist establishment that followed. The Great Recession of 2008 cracked the illusion of endless growth. Wall Street was bailed out, but Main Street never recovered. College graduates faced mountains of debt. Workers in once thriving cities found themselves trapped in cycles of precarity. Meanwhile, racial and economic inequalities deepened, invisible to some, unbearable to others. It was in this fertile ground that the seeds of progressive rebellion took root. In New York, the rent was rising faster than wages. In California, wildfires raged as billionaires built bunkers. In the Midwest, unions were dismantled while healthcare remained a privilege, not a right. And through it all, a new generation asked the same question that had once echoed through the streets of Chicago in 1968. Whose world is this? For Zohran Mamdani, the answer was personal. The son of Mahmoud Mamdani, a Ugandan-born scholar of empire and post-colonial identity, and Munira Rashida, an Indian-born artist, Zohran's worldview was a tapestry woven from displacement, diaspora, and defiance. Raised in Kampala and New York, he carried within him a dual consciousness: the global South's memory of resistance and the urban North's experience of inequality. In college, while others prepared for corporate careers, Mamdani immersed himself in community organizing. He saw in Harlem and Queens not just neighborhoods, but living stories of migration, exploitation, and survival. And like the radical intellectuals of his father's generation, he began to question, what does liberation mean in the age of neoliberalism? The new left that emerged around him did not wear one face. It was a mosaic of movements: feminist, environmentalist, socialist, decolonial, and abolitionist. Each one fought a different battle, yet their heartbeats pulsed in unison. The fight for Black lives was not just a demand for justice, it was a critique of capitalism itself. The push for climate action was not just about emissions, but about greed. The call for Medicare for all was not a utopian dream, but a moral necessity in a country where health was a commodity. For the first time in decades, words once dismissed as fringe, socialism, solidarity, and systemic reform, returned to the public square. The streets of Minneapolis, Washington Square Park, and Brooklyn became laboratories of democracy, where chants replaced speeches and movements replaced parties. In this new political ecosystem, charisma gave way to community. Gone were the days of the solitary leader. In their place rose networks, collectives, and coalitions. Mutual aid groups fed neighbors during the pandemic when governments failed. Tenant unions organized rent strikes in the face of eviction. Digital campaigns mobilized millions with a hashtag and a cause. This was politics by participation, not permission. And in the midst of this awakening, Zohran Mamdani's campaign for New York State Assembly became more than an election. It was a microcosm of a movement. When Zohran Mamdani ran for office in Queens' 36th district, few believed an open socialist could unseat a well-entrenched incumbent. The establishment dismissed him as idealistic. The media treated him as symbolic. But they underestimated the quiet revolution happening in Astoria's apartments and coffee shops. Volunteers, teachers, taxi drivers, artists, and students built a grassroots operation fueled not by corporate dollars, but by conviction. Door by door, they told a story that resonated: that housing is a human right, that healthcare should not bankrupt families, and that politics should serve people, not profit. The campaign became a form of civic education. People who had never voted before found their voices. Immigrants who had long felt invisible began to believe that power could in fact belong to them. And when Zohran won, it wasn't just a victory for a candidate. It was a signal that the new left was not a theory anymore. It was a force. But the new left was never meant to be comfortable. Its rise triggered fierce resistance, not only from conservatives, but from the liberal establishment itself. Critics accused figures like Mamdani, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders of utopianism, fiscal irresponsibility, and political naivety. Mainstream media labeled them radical, as if demanding healthcare and housing were acts of extremism. Yet what the establishment called radical, millions began to see as rational. The New Left's power was not in its perfection, but in its persistence. its ability to shift the moral center of politics. It forced America to confront its myths, that capitalism is freedom, that meritocracy is fairness, and that inequality is inevitable. Across the globe, similar awakenings were taking place. In Chile, students toppled an old constitution written under dictatorship. In India, farmers marched against neoliberal reforms. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, though defeated, reshaped discourse around austerity and welfare. The struggle was no longer national, it was transnational. Bound by digital threads, activists from different continents shared strategies, symbols, and solidarity. And at the heart of it all was a shared belief that politics must serve life, not markets. Yet the New Left was not without contradictions. Its decentralized nature made it vibrant but vulnerable. Without clear hierarchies, it often struggled with coherence. Movements rose and fell at the speed of hashtags. Online solidarity sometimes failed to translate into structural change. Critics from within warned that passion without strategy could burn out, that revolution without reflection could repeat history's mistakes. Still, amid the chaos, there was beauty, a kind of democratic experimentation the world had not seen in decades. For Mamdani and his contemporaries, this meant learning to balance idealism with pragmatism, to speak truth to power while also learning the language of policy. Inside the New York Assembly, Mamdani pushed for tenant protections, police reform, and public banking, initiatives that connected the moral outrage of the streets with the procedural grind of governance. He represented a bridge between protest and policy, between moral vision and legislative action. And like the young radicals of the 1960s, he faced the same paradox: how to remain revolutionary while operating within a system built to resist change. By the early 2020s, the New Left had begun to reshape not only politics but culture. Art, music, and social media became vehicles of political storytelling. Podcasts and documentaries, the new pamphlets of our age, amplified voices long ignored. In a society saturated with marketing, authenticity became rebellion. The aesthetic of the New Left was not polished or corporate, it was raw, communal, and unapologetically moral. Murals of George Floyd, climate marches led by teenagers, and community gardens in gentrified neighborhoods all spoke a language of quiet resistance. At its core, the New Left was not merely a set of policies, it was a philosophy of belonging. It asked, what if democracy means more than voting every 4 years? What if equality means more than access, but agency? It demanded a politics rooted in empathy, not efficiency. A vision of society where dignity was not earned, but assumed. This was the moral heart of Mamdani's rebellion, not anger for its own sake, but anger as a form of love. Love for the working class, love for immigrants, love for justice itself. In one of his early speeches, Mamdani said, "The greatest myth we've been sold is that politics is something done for us, not by us. The truth is, democracy begins when we stop waiting for saviors." That line became emblematic of the movement's ethos. The New Left was not waiting for permission to act. It was already building alternatives, community-owned energy projects, cooperative housing, free food networks, local journalism initiatives. Each small act of self-determination chipped away at the edifice of neoliberal fatalism. But the story of the New Left is far from over. It remains a movement of becoming, torn between the urgency of now and the patience of history. It struggles, as all revolutions do, to transform moral clarity into material change. And yet its greatest triumph may lie not in what it achieves today, but in what it has made imaginable again. That a more humane politics is not a fantasy. That solidarity can survive cynicism. That hope, against all odds, can still be organized. As the credits of this chapter fade, the voice of Zohran Mamdani, calm, deliberate, and defiant, echoes through the noise of modern politics. The message is simple but seismic. We are not the radicals, we are the realists of a broken world. The New Left was never about tearing down the system for the sake of it. It was about rebuilding belonging in a world that had forgotten what it meant to care. And as long as voices like Mamdani speak from the margins, unbought, unafraid, and unyielding, the rebellion will continue. Because history, as it has always been, is not written by the victors. It is written by those who refuse to surrender. By the dawn of the third decade of the 21st century, revolution no longer marched solely through the streets. It scrolled, streamed, and trended. The New Left had found its megaphone, not in the printing press or the radio, but in the infinite corridors of the internet. What had once been a tool of entertainment and distraction became the infrastructure of rebellion. Hashtags replaced manifestos, live streams replaced speeches, and what began as isolated cries of injustice began to weave themselves into an unbroken digital chorus. The rise of digital activism transformed the relationship between citizens and power. No longer did one need a platform to speak, the platform was the power. From the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, from #Black Lives Matter to #MeToo, the internet became the new commons of dissent, chaotic, decentralized, and electrifying. It was here that the New Left's global consciousness found form. Boundaries dissolved, solidarity became borderless. A protest in Minneapolis could inspire a march in Mumbai. A tweet from a student in Cairo could echo in a classroom in London. The world had never been more fragmented, yet never more connected. For leaders like Zohran Mamdani, who came of age in this era, digital media was not an accessory to politics, it was politics. Social platforms became stages for radical imagination. Instagram carousels explained capitalism in pastel tones. TikTok creators turned economic inequality into viral skits. Twitter threads became archives of protest history. The revolution had gone multimedia. But beyond the aesthetics, something deeper was happening: the democratization of voice. No longer filtered through corporate media or political elites, ordinary citizens were narrating their own struggles, their own dreams, their own truths. And in that self-expression lay the essence of the new progressive spirit: authenticity as defiance. Yet as every generation of rebels discovers, the tools of liberation are never neutral. The same algorithms that amplified voices of justice also rewarded outrage. The same platforms that built communities also profited from their polarization. Mamdani, like many within the movement, recognized this paradox. In interviews and speeches, he warned that the fight for democracy online was not just about expression, it was about ownership. Who controls the platforms? Who profits from engagement? Who decides what is seen and unseen? It was a question that haunted the digital left. Could you build revolution on servers owned by billionaires? But despite these contradictions, the internet had already altered the DNA of activism. Protests were now organized in hours, not weeks. Crowdfunding replaced campaign fundraising. Live streams turned local injustices into global spectacles. When police brutality unfolded in New York or Nigeria, the footage bypassed state control, reaching millions before official narratives could rewrite it. This immediacy was power. The camera had become the conscience of the world. For the New Left, digital technology was not just a medium, it was a weapon of witness. In the 2020s, as populism tightened its grip across continents, digital activism became both a lifeline and a battlefield. Progressive politicians like Zohran Mamdani, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar learned to speak algorithmically, merging moral conviction with meme culture, long-form policy with viral soundbite. They understood that the new political frontier was not the Senate floor, but the social feed. Through live-stream Q&As, campaign reels, and community calls broadcast on Instagram Live, They turned politics into participation. The people were no longer spectators, they were collaborators. This was the crowdsourced revolution, powered by clicks but sustained by conscience. And yet, beneath the euphoria of digital democracy, there pulsed an unease. The same platforms that had birthed the progressive awakening were also being weaponized by authoritarian regimes and corporate interests. Disinformation became the new propaganda. Digital surveillance replaced the secret police. Mamdani's generation found itself trapped in a double bind, using systems designed to commodify them in order to liberate themselves. The digital age had democratized dissent, but it had also digitized control. Still, amidst the noise, the movement persisted, because what technology could distort, human intention could redeem. The story of this digital uprising is not just about hashtags or algorithms, it is about rediscovering the moral imagination of democracy in an era of cynicism. In online classrooms, artists and organizers taught political literacy through design, storytelling, and humor. Mutual aid networks used Google Sheets to feed families. Digital archives preserved protest art for future generations. The screen became the new town square, imperfect but alive with possibility. And for Mamdani, this was the point. The revolution was not about tearing down systems, but reprogramming them for humanity. Every movement must eventually ask itself, what happens after awareness? By the mid-2020s, the New Left had mastered digital storytelling. But the next challenge was harder, transforming connection into consequence. The clicks had to become coalitions. The hashtags had to become housing bills, healthcare reforms, and climate policies. Mamdani and others began to shift focus from performance to policy, from mobilization to material change. The digital rebellion needed an offline backbone. Across the country, progressive organizers began building what they called the new infrastructure of power. It wasn't made of glass towers or lobby offices, but of community networks. Unions, cooperatives, advocacy groups, and campaign collectives that blurred the line between activism and governance. In New York, Mamdani's office became a hub for organizing around public banking, a radical yet pragmatic idea to keep community wealth within community hands. In Los Angeles, digital activists transformed their mutual aid groups into housing cooperatives. In Chicago, teachers who had once marched on picket lines began running for local office. This was the quiet institutionalization of the New Left, a movement learning to build, not just to protest. But building comes with its own burdens. The more the movement entered formal politics, the more it risked losing the spontaneity that gave it life. The bureaucratic machinery of governance demanded patience, where protest demanded urgency. For figures like Mamdani, this tension was constant between the ideal and the achievable, the moral and the pragmatic. Yet he insisted that this was not compromise, it was evolution. If protest is the heartbeat, then policy is the muscle. You need both to move. The New Left's true innovation lay in how it redefined participation. In the old model, citizens were voters. In the new model, they were co-creators. People designed their own solutions, from local climate plans to worker-owned tech platforms. The internet served as an incubator for civic imagination. Ideas that would once have taken years to circulate could now evolve overnight. The New Left became an open-source project, iterative, collaborative, and experimental. And through this ecosystem, a new type of leader emerged, the movement builder, not the messiah. Mamdani embodied this ethos. In his work with tenants, taxi workers, and small businesses, he treated representation not as authority, but as accountability. His office did not simply advocate for constituents, it co-organized with them. Whether fighting eviction or pushing for climate resilience, his approach blurred the boundary between government and grassroots. This was what made his brand of politics radical. Not its rhetoric, but its redistribution of power. But every new paradigm invites backlash. Conservative media painted the New Left as dangerous radicals. Corporate interests poured millions into counter-campaigns. Even within liberal circles, progressives were warned to tone it down, to be realistic. Yet, what Mamdani and others understood was that realism without justice was simply resignation. The goal was not to be liked by power, but to reshape what power meant. As the decade advanced, the lines between online and offline blurred completely. Climate marches organized on Reddit filled city squares. Digital petitions led to real-world legislation. Political education migrated to Discord servers and podcasts. Technology had fused with consciousness. The New Left had become a networked organism, one capable of adapting, mutating, and surviving even in environments designed to suppress it. But beneath the connectivity lay a profound philosophical question. What happens when everything becomes content? The very platforms that enabled the New Left's rise also commodified its image. Activism risked becoming aesthetic. Radicalism risked becoming trend. Mamdani often reflected on this with characteristic clarity. He said the danger is that we start mistaking visibility for victory. It was a warning that the revolution of the feed must eventually find its footing in the real world. And yet, despite these contradictions, there was no denying what had changed. A generation once dismissed as apathetic had become architects of new political vocabularies. They had turned isolation into solidarity, algorithms into allies, and cynicism into creativity. The internet, a space once dominated by consumerism, had become the most powerful classroom for democracy in the modern era. In the grand arc of history, the New Left's digital era will be remembered not just for what it achieved, but for what it imagined. It proved that democracy could be reborn in pixels and code, that empathy could travel through fiber optics, that justice, though delayed, could still be streamed live. And at the heart of it stood figures like Zohran Mamdani, not the hero of a single story, but the curator of a collective one. Because in this new world, leadership was no longer about commanding crowds, it was about connecting consciousness. The people's platform had arrived, not in marble halls, but in the glow of every screen where truth refused to be silenced. By the mid-2010s, a new wind began to sweep across the American political landscape. The old binaries of Republican versus Democrat were no longer enough to describe the fractures forming in the nation's conscience. A younger generation, shaped by the Great Recession, disillusioned by endless wars, burdened by student debt, and disenchanted with corporate politics, began searching for something else. This search gave birth to the New Left, a loose but growing coalition of activists, organizers, and elected officials who sought to redefine what progress meant in 21st century America. In New York, Zohran Mamdani stood at the center of this rising tide. A young Ugandan-born, Indian-raised, Queens-based politician, Mamdani's life embodied the hybrid identity of the new generation. He was global in his outlook, but deeply local in his fight. His campaigns, whether for housing justice, labor rights, or ending oppressive policing, were not abstract ideals, but urgent calls for survival in working-class neighborhoods that had long been ignored by mainstream politics. The seeds of this rebellion had been planted years earlier. Movements like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter had already shattered the illusion that America was a nation of equal opportunity. The chants of "We are the 99% and no justice, no peace" had become rallying cries for a generation radicalized by inequality and racial violence. As the Democratic establishment drifted further toward corporate centrism, voices like Mamdani's began to rise in defiance. He represented a politics not of compromise, but of confrontation, rooted in the belief that true democracy must be reclaimed from billionaires, landlords, and political elites. But Mamdani's rise wasn't just a local story. It symbolized a larger rebellion happening across the United States, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx, to Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, to Rashida Tlaib in Michigan. Together, they were reimagining what political power could look like when wielded by people who had never been meant to have it. The New Left was not content with reforming the system. It wanted to reinvent it. Its members spoke not only of healthcare and housing, but of dignity, not just of wages, but of worth. Their revolution was moral as much as it was material. In the neighborhoods of Astoria and Jackson Heights, Mamdani's campaign headquarters became a hub of this energy. Volunteers knocked on doors not with pre-written scripts, but with lived experiences. Renters, gig workers, taxi drivers, and immigrants found their stories mirrored in his speeches. He often said, "We don't just deserve to live, we deserve to thrive." That simple sentence resonated with thousands. As the old guard of New York politics watched, the unthinkable began to happen. Grassroots candidates running on shoestring budgets and powered by volunteers were defeating career politicians backed by real estate developers and Wall Street donors. The establishment had underestimated the hunger for change. And Mamdani's victory, when it came, was not just his own. It was a signal, a declaration that the future of politics would not be decided in corporate boardrooms or party back rooms, but on the streets, among the people who felt the system's weight most directly. The New Left had arrived, and it wasn't asking for permission. Winning an election was only the beginning. The true test came afterward, when the idealism of campaign promises collided with the machinery of governance. Inside the marble halls of Albany, Zohran Mamdani quickly learned that change, in politics, moves slowly, especially when it threatens entrenched power. Landlords, corporate lobbyists, and conservative Democrats all worked tirelessly to stall or water down the reforms he championed. But Mamdani refused to retreat. He co-founded the Socialist Caucus in the New York State Assembly, aligning with other Democratic socialists to push for radical legislation. Together they fought for good cause eviction, a bill designed to give tenants protection from arbitrary rent hikes and displacement. For working-class families across New York, this law could mean the difference between stability and homelessness. Opponents dismissed it as too extreme, but to Mamdani, extremism meant the system that allowed billionaires to profit while families were evicted in winter. Outside the chambers, the movement kept growing. The streets became classrooms for democracy. Students debated policy at protest rallies. Organizers live-streamed city hall hearings. Community members wrote op-eds, circulated petitions, and built mutual aid networks. The boundary between activism and governance began to blur, a hallmark of the New Left's philosophy. Mamdani called it movement politics, a belief that political office is not the end goal, but one of many tools in the broader fight for justice. His critics accused him of being idealistic, of chasing dreams incompatible with real-world politics. But history has often belonged to the dreamers. As the movement gained traction, backlash grew louder. Conservative media painted the New Left as radical socialists, anti-capitalist revolutionaries, or even threats to American values. Yet beneath the noise, a quiet transformation was underway. In workplaces, more unions formed. In universities, students demanded divestment from fossil fuels. In neighborhoods, communities began experimenting with cooperative housing, shared kitchens, and local councils. This was no longer just a political wave, it was a cultural awakening. The New Left was redefining what success meant. It wasn't measured in GDP or stock market indices, but in community resilience, equality, and solidarity. And through it all, Zohran Mamdani stood as a voice of reason and rebellion, a bridge between idealism and practical change. In one speech, he said, "We are told that politics is about what is possible, but every great change in history began with people who refused to accept the limits of the possible." Those words captured the essence of the movement. Like the civil rights activists of the 1960s and the anti-war protesters of the 1970s, the New Left saw itself as part of a continuum, a lineage of struggle stretching across generations. They were fighting not just for policies, but for a paradigm shift, for a world where power flowed upward from the people, not downward from elites. By 2024, the Progressive Rebellion had become a global conversation. Movements in the UK, Canada, and Latin America echoed similar demands for economic justice, climate accountability, and political transparency. What began as a handful of local races in New York had evolved into a worldwide dialogue about the future of democracy itself. Zohran Mamdani's story, then, was not just a political biography, it was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that history's direction is not predetermined. Each generation must decide for itself. Will it conform to the systems it inherits or challenge them to be better? The New Left chose the latter. And as the cameras fade, one truth remains. Every rebellion begins with someone who dares to imagine the impossible. Every revolution invites a response. Every act of progress sparks resistance. And as the New Left gained traction, reshaping the language of politics, challenging corporate interests, and rewriting the boundaries of what was possible, a counteroffensive began to take form. In Washington, in state houses, in media boardrooms, the guardians of the old order were watching closely. To them, figures like Zohran Mamdani, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and others represented more than just a political shift. They symbolized an existential threat to the status quo. The backlash came swiftly and strategically. Corporate-funded PACs poured millions into opposing progressive candidates. Editorials warned of socialist overreach. Conservative think tanks flooded airwaves with talking points that painted the New Left as reckless, naive, or dangerous. The word radical became a weapon, used to silence rather than to describe. Yet the movement had anticipated this. Zohran Mamdani often said, "If you're not making the powerful uncomfortable, you're not doing politics, you're doing public relations." And uncomfortable they were. The Progressive Rebellion had unearthed uncomfortable truths, that millions of Americans lived one paycheck away from eviction, that billion-dollar corporations paid less in taxes than school teachers, that racism, climate disaster, and poverty were not separate issues, but symptoms of the same system. But the old guard understood something the movement sometimes forgot. Power fights back. In the New York State Assembly, Mamdani's proposals met relentless opposition. The Good Cause Eviction Bill, one of his signature efforts, was blocked multiple times. Landlord lobbies launched smear campaigns warning that tenant protections would destroy the housing market. Meanwhile, centrist Democrats, under pressure from donors, often sided with conservatives. Outside the halls of government, the culture war machine spun into motion. Progressive politicians were accused of being anti-police, anti-Israel, or anti-American. The narrative was simple but effective. To question power was to betray the nation. But while the establishment attacked from above, the grassroots fought back from below. In community centers, in cafes, in union halls and college campuses, people kept organizing. The pandemic had already exposed the fragility of America's systems, its healthcare, housing, and labor infrastructure, and the New Left capitalized on that awareness. Mamdani's district offices became centers of mutual aid. distributing food, rent assistance, and resources. It wasn't just politics, it was survival. The movement's critics accused it of being idealistic, of dreaming too big in a world that demanded compromise. But the very conditions that birthed the New Left, inequality, injustice, indifference, were still festering. And compromise, for many, had simply become another word for surrender. By 2023, as inflation soared and economic uncertainty deepened, the fault lines in American politics widened further. The right doubled down on nationalism and nostalgia. The center clung to pragmatism. But the left, battered yet unbroken, refused to disappear. Zohran Mamdani, in speeches across New York, urged a reframing of what radical truly meant. He said, to demand health care for all in the richest country on earth is not radical. To ensure no child goes hungry is not radical. What's radical, he said, is accepting a system that lets billionaires exist while people freeze outside their empty buildings. Those words reverberated through protest marches and social media feeds, amplifying a sentiment shared by millions across the world. The backlash, as intense as it was, could not erase the underlying truth that the New Left had changed the conversation forever. As the movement matured, it began facing a more complex challenge, not external attacks, but internal reckoning. The New Left was not a monolith. It was a coalition, diverse, decentralized, and often divided. There were ideological rifts between democratic socialists and progressives, between activists and legislators, between those who believed in reforming the system and those who wanted to replace it entirely. Zohran Mamdani, often seen as a unifier, found himself navigating this difficult terrain. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the need to balance radical vision with pragmatic strategy. Revolution is not just about protest, it's about persistence. It's easy to fight the system from the outside. The real test is fighting it from within without letting it change who you are. This tension between idealism and realism defined the movement's next phase. Some progressives joined government agencies to enact gradual change. Others left politics entirely, disillusioned by bureaucracy. Meanwhile, corporate interests adapted, adopting the language of social responsibility and sustainability, while continuing exploitative practices behind the scenes. The New Left had forced capitalism to change its vocabulary, but not yet its nature. Still, the cultural impact was undeniable. Young Americans no longer saw socialism as a dirty word. The language of equity, intersectionality, and environmental justice had entered classrooms, workplaces, and dinner tables. And globally, movements for workers' rights and climate action found renewed energy. In this shifting landscape, Zohran Mamdani emerged as both a leader and a learner. His experiences mirrored the trajectory of the entire left, full of triumphs, setbacks, and self-discovery. He pushed for housing justice not just as policy, but as a moral imperative. He stood in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, knowing it would invite backlash. He supported unions even when it meant alienating corporate allies. Each stance came with a cost, but also with clarity. Mamdani's politics were never about popularity. They were about principle. And in a world increasingly driven by polls and headlines, that made him an anomaly. As the decade neared its midpoint, the question remained, could the New Left sustain itself? The answer, perhaps, depended on whether it could evolve. In speeches and forums, Mamdani urged his supporters to look beyond electoral politics, to build institutions of their own. Worker cooperatives, community land trusts, public banks, and local energy collectives. These, he said, were the building blocks of a post-capitalist future. It was not about waiting for permission from power. It was about creating power anew. But history shows that every progressive movement must endure its winter. By 2025, the wave of enthusiasm that had carried the left to prominence began to ebb. Economic challenges, disinformation campaigns, and internal disputes sapped energy from the cause. Yet, even in its fatigue, the movement left behind a changed world. Policies once dismissed as radical, like student debt relief, universal health care proposals, and climate investment, had entered mainstream debate. Even conservative lawmakers were now forced to speak in the language of justice, fairness, and sustainability. In this way, the New Left achieved something extraordinary. It shifted the moral compass of politics. Whether or not it held power, it had changed the meaning of power itself. And for Zohran Mamdani, this was victory enough. He often reflected on his journey not as the story of a politician, but as the story of a people rediscovering their collective agency. The future doesn't belong to any of us. It belongs to those who organize for it, he once said. As the credits roll on this chapter of history, one truth endures. The struggle for justice never truly ends. It evolves, adapts, and passes from one generation to the next. The backlash may slow progress, but it cannot reverse awakening. The future of the left, its survival, its growth, its transformation, depends not on leaders or slogans, but on the courage of ordinary people who refuse to stop imagining better worlds. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Zohran Mamdani and the Progressive Rebellion. That even in defeat, the act of resistance itself is a form of victory. That hope, when organized, becomes power. And that every revolution, no matter how small, begins with a voice, whispering, then shouting. Another world is possible. History often judges movements by what they achieve, but the true measure lies not just in legislation, votes, or electoral victories. It is in the transformation of ideas, culture, and the political imagination. The Progressive Rebellion, spearheaded by figures like Zohran Mamdani, reshaped the boundaries of what Americans and the world believed was possible. The movement's impact was multi-layered. On the policy front, victories were tangible yet uneven. Progressive candidates successfully introduced bills to expand tenant protections, strengthen labor rights, and invest in public infrastructure. Housing, healthcare, and environmental policies were infused with a moral urgency that had previously been absent from mainstream politics. Mamdani's advocacy for affordable housing, for instance, did not simply change laws, it changed public discourse. Suddenly, the language of justice was intertwined with the language of governance. Renters' rights were no longer marginal issues, they became emblematic of broader social fairness. Cultural shifts paralleled legislative ones. The Progressive Rebellion normalized the discussion of wealth inequality, corporate responsibility, and social justice across dinner tables, classrooms, and boardrooms. Terms once considered fringe, like democratic socialism, universal basic income, or climate justice, entered mainstream vocabulary. This cultural penetration had strategic implications. Ideas that seem radical in one decade often become policy imperatives in the next. By forcing dialogue, activism, and debate, the New Left created a generational shift in political consciousness. At the same time, the movement challenged political orthodoxy. Centrism, long the dominant lens through which politicians defined electability, was no longer the sole path to legitimacy. Progressive voices demanded that morality, not mere pragmatism, guide decisions. Leaders who ignored these voices risked alienating younger constituents and activist networks that could mobilize rapidly through social media, protests, and grassroots organizing. Yet the legacy of the Progressive Rebellion cannot be measured only in wins. Losses, setbacks, and failed initiatives also became instructive. Many progressive policies faced institutional resistance. Corporate opposition, partisan obstruction, and bureaucratic inertia slowed or blocked transformative reforms. Some ambitious plans were diluted during negotiation, leaving only fragments of their original vision. But even these failures served a purpose. They highlighted the entrenched power structures that the movement sought to challenge, clarified strategy, and forged resilience among organizers. Every setback became a lesson in political navigation, coalition building, and the pragmatics of governance. The Progressive Rebellion also transformed political engagement. Voter turnout, particularly among young people and marginalized communities, surged. Activism was no longer episodic. It became a sustained cultural expectation. The idea that ordinary citizens could influence policy, shape narratives, and hold leaders accountable was reinforced through local councils, city halls, and grassroots campaigns. Zohran Mamdani often emphasized this principle. The most important legislation is not always written in Albany. Sometimes it is written in living rooms, on social media, and in the conversations we have with our neighbors. That is where power truly resides. In other words, the rebellion's greatest triumph was not simply in the bills passed or the offices won. It was in democratizing the very idea of power. Movements, by their nature, are laboratories of strategy and risk. The Progressive Rebellion offered lessons not only to its adherents, but to anyone interested in social transformation. One key lesson was the importance of narrative. Zohran Mamdani and his peers understood that policy alone was insufficient. Emotional resonance, storytelling, and symbolism were necessary to mobilize public support. Whether advocating for rent control or climate action, the movement framed issues in terms of human dignity, moral responsibility, and collective well-being. Another lesson was coalition building. The Progressive Rebellion was inherently intersectional. It linked racial justice, economic equity, environmental sustainability, and political representation into a single framework. While this complexity sometimes caused friction, it also created a resilient base. Activists and voters from diverse backgrounds found a home within the movement, united by shared values even when tactical disagreements arose. Resilience emerged as another critical lesson. The backlash, intense and relentless, tested both leaders and supporters. The New Left endured smear campaigns, legislative obstruction, and media attacks. Yet these challenges strengthened rather than weakened the movement. Mamdani often remarked, "Resilience is not about surviving the storm. It's about learning to dance in the rain." This approach emphasized adaptability. Leaders learned to balance pragmatism with principle, strategy with idealism, and long-term vision with short-term action. Such lessons ensured that the movement could persist even amid political turbulence. Technology also played a dual role. Social media amplified progressive messages and mobilized supporters. But it also exposed the movement to disinformation, harassment, and polarization. Navigating this digital landscape became a core skill, one that required both savvy communication and critical literacy. For the Progressive Rebellion, the digital sphere was not just a battlefield, but a tool for education, connection, and organization. Online campaigns raised awareness, coordinated volunteers, and provided rapid response to political developments. The movement demonstrated that modern activism requires fluency in both physical and digital spaces. Another lesson concerned patience and persistence. Social transformation is rarely immediate. The Progressive Rebellion achieved symbolic victories quickly, but systemic change, whether in housing, taxation, labor law, or climate policy, remained incremental. Activists learned to celebrate small wins while maintaining focus on long-term objectives. Mamdani often reflected on this dynamic. Change does not always arrive as a tidal wave. Sometimes it is a series of ripples, but every ripple shapes the shore. Critically, the rebellion highlighted the moral dimensions of politics. The movement challenged the idea that pragmatism must always trump principle. Leaders and citizens alike were reminded that decisions should be measured not solely in efficiency or profitability, but in justice, fairness, and human impact.
While the Progressive Rebellion was rooted in American politics, its impact reverberated globally. Activists in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia watched as a new generation of politicians demonstrated that progressive ideals could win elections and shape discourse. Zohran Mamdani's approach, emphasizing empathy, policy, and grassroots organization, became a model for aspiring leaders worldwide. His blend of idealism and pragmatism illustrated a key lesson. Transformative politics requires both moral clarity and tactical acumen. Internationally, the rebellion inspired conversations about housing justice, climate equity, healthcare, and social inclusion. Movements in countries facing economic inequality or political stagnation adopted similar strategies, combining emotional storytelling, local activism, and media engagement to challenge entrenched power. The New Left's global resonance also underscored the interconnectedness of modern political struggles. Climate crises, wealth inequality, and migration patterns are transnational. Local activism could no longer be isolated from global forces. Mamdani's model demonstrated that principled leadership, when paired with networked communities, can transcend borders. Looking ahead, the Progressive Rebellion faces new challenges. Polarization, misinformation, and institutional resistance remain persistent obstacles. Economic crises, climate disasters, and social unrest provide both opportunities and risks. Yet the movement is better equipped than ever. Lessons in coalition building, digital organizing, and policy advocacy provide a robust foundation for future campaigns. Leaders like Mamdani have nurtured a culture of mentorship, ensuring that knowledge and experience are passed to younger activists. Moreover, the rebellion has reshaped expectations of governance. Citizens no longer accept token gestures or superficial reforms. They demand accountability, transparency, and participation. Politicians, regardless of ideology, are now judged against the moral framework established by the Progressive Rebellion: equity, justice, and responsiveness. Ultimately, the legacy of Zohran Mamdani and the Progressive Rebellion is both practical and symbolic. It is seen in the laws passed, the policies debated, and the offices held. But it is also seen in the imagination it unlocked, the belief that ordinary people can organize, challenge power, and create change. Politics, Mamdani once said, is not a spectator sport. If you wait for someone else to fix it, you will always be disappointed. Change is made by those willing to act, to organize, to believe. This lesson, timeless and urgent, extends beyond any individual or movement. It reminds us that democracy is not a static institution. It is a living process, sustained by engagement, courage, and persistent hope. The Progressive Rebellion may be anchored in the early decades of the 21st century, but its principles endure. Its story is not finished. It is written every day in city halls, classrooms, streets, and screens. Its victories, setbacks, and lessons form a blueprint for future generations, proving that justice, when pursued relentlessly, can reshape the political landscape. In the end, the Progressive Rebellion teaches a final truth: that change is possible even against formidable odds, that courage, principle, and organization can challenge entrenched systems, and that a movement led by visionaries like Zohran Mamdani can ignite a spirit of possibility that no backlash, no defeat, and no obstacle can fully extinguish. The stage is global, the actors are many, and the story is ongoing. And as long as there are those willing to act, the Progressive Rebellion will continue. Its echoes reverberating in policies, in culture, and in the hearts of those who dare to imagine a better world. History isn't made by spectators. It's made by those who act. Zohran Mamdani in the New Left show us what courage, vision, and collective action can achieve. Your voice matters. Your choices shape the future. Engage, advocate, debate, vote. Be part of the story. Subscribe, follow, and stay connected. The past shows what's possible. The future waits for those brave enough to step forward. Change begins with awareness. Action makes it real.